This is part 2 of my video tutorial on working with swags to add interest and variety to your bowls. In part 1, I showed you 2 typical glue-ups for making swags. In this first one over here, the background wood is hickory and I used 1/4-inch strips of bloodwood. The strips run tangential to the rings, to the circles. When you glue up a blank in this way, you will automatically get swags. In the second glue up, I used shedua, which is a wood I had never heard of and have not come across since, in the cut-off pile of my favorite lumber yard, and I decided to laminate in strips of plywood with the face up, with the striped side facing out, just because I had never done that before. Notice that these are wider pieces. These are about 1/2 inch. And the third glue-up uses the hexagon as the basis of the glue-up, which is the glue-up that I used for the footed candy dish in my book. But here, instead of using solid strips, I glued up strips, in a sense, made my own plywood, using thin pieces of yellow heart and bloodwood. The bloodwood was sandwiched in the middle. I glued them up, as I explained in part 1, exactly the same way as is described in the book. Now, I also used 1/4-inch rings for this because I wanted to cover as many rings as possible. I used 3/8-inch rings here, these blanks which sanded down to 11/16 of an inch, took a 30-degree angle nicely, and I cut some rings. For these two, I cut the rings as though I were going to make a bowl. Most people do not have trouble up to this point. The tricky part comes in gluing things up where it looks as though everything matches until you glue it up and then start sanding and then discover that the more you sand, the less regular it is. It took me a good year before I figured out how to correct this and how to reliably get swags that glue up. Now remember, the more dramatic the contrast, the less forgiving your mistakes will be, which is one of the nice things about working with plywood, since it's sort of fuzzy and irregular. And in fact, in one article that I read where somebody did glue-ups with plywood, he said the irregularity and mismatches only added charm to the piece, which I didn't believe for a moment, but it meant you could get away with it. All right, let's start with this blank, because this is the easiest one to see. I cut 3 rings, and as you know, if you've made several bowls, I marked the tops of these. And if you've been meticulous about marking your guidelines, that will also help with the glue up. I have 3 rings and a base, and typically you would stack them together. You would glue these rings together, and then sand the inside, and then add the base. All right, when you're working with swags, it makes sense to go ring by ring, just to make sure everything stays in place. It's a little extra time, but if you use a glue like Weld Bond, which sets up very quickly, you can give it a quick setup, 10 minutes or so, then pull it out and add the next ring. All right, so I stack my top ring, my first ring, on top of the second ring, and I'm going to take a look on the inside. This, by the way, has not been sanded at all. This is as it comes from the scroll saw. So any marks, burn marks, things like that that you see would get taken care of eventually. Now I'm going to line it up, for starters, on the inside, matching my guidelines and trying to get as good a match as I can for all rings. All right, now, this looks pretty good to me, but I haven't looked at the outside yet. Now the way these are cut, your inside swags will always cover fewer rings than the outside. The thinner your ring, the closer they are in size. The thicker your ring, the more the discrepancy. So it's easier to start, usually, inside. All right, now, I'm going to take a look and see what that looks like on the outside. Now here's the tricky part. However carefully you cut, it's never going to be perfect. And what you need to do is to anticipate how it's going to look when it's sanded smooth, which is sometimes very different from the way it aligns when it's not. There was a place here I noticed that's probably the best place for teaching purposes. If you look at this as it looks straight on, this looks very irregular. However, if you look straight down on it, and what I'll do is I'll take a still picture of this so that you can see. Where it meets this ring, the line just goes back and meets perfectly. And that really, really does work. I didn't believe it at first. As I said, it's sort of counterintuitive. You tend to want to make things match immediately, but you're looking to anticipate. In a sense, you're compensating for not having cut things perfectly. Now, if you have one of those saws with a tilting head and find that you can do things perfectly, you will have less trouble. If your cutting is very uneven, you'll have more trouble, but since it came from the same blank, there is a place, and you can tweak it until you can see it more clearly. Now, we do the same thing with this schedule blank, which was a bear to cut. There were places here that had all sorts of burn on them, and I just kept changing my blades. This will work up beautifully, by the way. All of this stuff is just surface. It'll sand right off, and you'll have a really dramatic looking bowl. Here, I found out that by putting the plywood in face side up, you end up with stripes. Now, when this is finished, the stripes will jump out at you, and if instead of using plywood, you glued up your own strips of colorful wood, you'd have a very interesting ribbony swag, and people would not be able to figure out how you did it. Now, notice, given the thickness of the wood that was laminated in, you have a very different effect from the first bowl, and it will look weird on the top until you sand this. As you sand this edge, you're going to get your smooth swag effect, and you can, by your sanding, determine how far apart these are going to be, and do your final tweaking. But it's done exactly the same by ring, looking to see. Here, this is a little harder to see because of the lack of color contrast, but looking to see where they will join. And as I said, and let me stress again, to make your life easier, make one ring slightly smaller than the other so you can look either down, top down, or from the inverted side. And if you do that, you'll find magically everything will glue up. Now, the third blank that I glued up, where I just cut one ring because I'm still working on it, gives you different kinds of swags. This is what would happen if you glued up your plywood instead of face up, if you glued it so that the plies were up instead of out. And then as you cut through, you go through the different plies. And if you glue up your own plywood, you're going to get very dramatic colors. And this also is matched up the same way. Let's see, I marked it up over here. I'm working with 2 blanks on this, so I had to keep a lot of things together. But it's done exactly the same way. I'll turn it upside down, right side up. Look and see, I'm working here with the yellow, looking to see where the yellow will meet when they're sanded flush. Now, I'm going to discuss more about what I'm going to do with this, as well as some other tips about working with plywood in part 3 of the video. So if you want to learn more about this approach, then look at the third part.